Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
Islam begins with Muhammad. It's interesting, there is very little biographical information about him in the Quran or even in the Hadiths. Most of it comes from oral traditions that were slowly written down and compiled in the 8th or 9th century. So these things were written down a good 100 years or more after Muhammad died. And is the case with most history up until the modern period, and some could say even during them, where the history was not what we would call objective, right? You're talking about the history of heroes. And, the Bible falls into that category. Quran, the Christian Bible, all that's Josephus, although Josephus already was influenced by the Greco-Roman traditions of history, so there are facts. And even these other gatherings of stories, there are facts woven in there. The question is, it's just difficult to separate between the facts and the interpretation of the facts. It's very often the interpretation of the facts that's built in, which is to teach a lesson, not just to review what happened. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate. Anyway, so the traditions about him, but there's a lot of the way it exists. And this is all secondhand. I am not an expert in Islamic. I say that up front, and the information that I have read is you can read as well. But the point is, just to complete the thought. We learn about his family. We learn a lot about what happened in Medina, which used to be called Yathrib. So so he lived in Mecca. Muhammad began to have revelations from God or through the angel Gabriel. And when we read our first passage, the voice that is talking to him is probably the angel Gabriel. Anyway, so he starts in 613. Interesting, 613. Okay, and you never knew. I didn't know really that has a significant number in Islam as well. All right, so in the year 613, he began to get revelations, and he shared them with. And he had a small following. It grew a little bit, but and there were tensions that developed between him and his people. And the dominant culture of Arabia, which was essentially pagan. The religious culture was pagan. So in 622, he and a group of followers decide that they will go to Yathrib, now called Medina, and see what they could do about establishing themselves over there. So they go to Medina, and slowly, word gets out, and the numbers who are interested in what's to offer begin to grow. So once again, tension develops between the locals and Muhammad and his people, who are now, increasingly local people who like what he's teaching. And eventually, the same thing happens. Tension break out. There's war. And over a period of 6 years, it takes from 622, which is, by the way, the date that is the Islamic calendar begins. Okay, it's the date that is it, 620. So anyway, so by 628, he has basically done away with the opposition in Medina, and he feels strong enough to go back to Mecca and to try to establish himself there. It turns out that the situations in Mecca had changed a bit, and basically he takes over Mecca with very little fighting. The people there they had continued to believe in his teachings, and that number continued to grow. Apparently, as often happens, the established religion did what many established religions end up doing, at least in the eyes of some people. They become corrupt. and the material elements of it become more significant than the spiritual. So you have these revolts that take place over time. It happens all over the place. And so Muhammad comes representing a whole new take on things, and he is established in 628. And basically, he continues to teach and preach. The numbers grow. And he passes away in 632 by illness. Nothing, dramatic, not in battle, nothing like that. And the wars that will be waged afterward, they didn't happen. They didn't begin yet. That happens after he dies. His generals believe that the message that he is conveying should be spread. And so they begin to do that between the years 635, but in that next decade, much of the Middle East is conquered by Islam, by the Islamic army. And the fact is, and that could be explained because the Persian Empire was by that time so spread out that it was overextended. And so that began to fall apart. And eventually, many, many areas of it were taken on, even to the point where later on, even Iran is Islamicized. So basically, that brings an end to the Persian rule. Then, of course, in the 8th century, from North Africa, Muslims cross over into Spain and conquer Spain. And that's later, in this early 700s. So that was done. It was almost like a blitzkrieg, because in these various areas, the Arabs, they knew from war, they knew how to do it, and they were also interestingly, they were relatively urbanized. Agriculture was not a big deal for them, obviously, right? They live in a desert. And so when they needed to put together, if you think sociologically, it's easier for them to put together groups of people than it is when you live in places where you have a lot of agriculture or mixed, economy. And so they knew how to go out, build forts, fight, set up, move on, etc. The other thing is, and this is relevant to where we're going to begin, they were also smart, and they realized that the religious communities in the countries that they conquered, be they Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, whatever, these were the people who had beforehand, because the Persians were generally open-minded about it, they had worked themselves into positions of local authority by being, I won't say politicians, but community servers, mayors, or maybe not mayors, but heads of this, heads of that, running the mail, officials of the government. And the Muslims the new guys on the block didn't have any experience doing this. So they allowed, and you find in the early stages of Islam, after these conquests, that a form of tolerance develops. Muhammad had already established the roots of that, as you will see, because he had to deal with these people both in Mecca and Medina, because they were there beforehand, especially Medina. So he understood, and his people understood, that if they're going to rule, they don't know the area. Let us engage those who do know, and we will give them privileges and tolerate, especially since the prophet told us that these people of the book are people who find favor within the eyes of Allah. Okay? And so we had substance. Okay. So that's just, a quick overview of what had happened. But the thing is now focusing specifically on the Jews in Medina, and I mentioned this before when we were talking about Martin Luther, this notion of unrequited love, right? Where Muhammad believed that because he was teaching the message of Moses, which he believed he was doing, the Jews would flock to him. I'm talking the Jews in Medina, right? But he, and that idea developed, but from his perspective, the sad truth was that the tribes, and there was two or three substantial Jewish tribes in Medina who, through assimilation, business, whatever, sort of aligned themselves with the pagans. That's where the buck was, so to speak, right? Those were the contact. And so at the outset, once Muhammad began to move against the clans and tribes, the pagan ones, he expected that the Jews would come running to him and help him deal with them. But instead, they joined up with the pagans. I'm simplifying, but that's what happened. So consequently, he got very angry at them. And you can see that in the anger in things that he writes, because in his mind, he says, there are Jews who follow the law of Moses and are, committed to that. But there are a lot of Jews, most of them don't. And he probably has in mind the assimilated one, we don't know what their practice, but who did not, at least in his eye, live up to the standards of Moses and did not follow even their own Torah. Thought was filled with error, but nonetheless, there was truth in there. And the basic elements of it were not even being followed by the Jews. And that made them fair game because they are sinners, not just by his understanding of it, but by what Allah would believe. And if they only followed, and he says, as you'll read, if you've read them over, you saw it, if they would have followed their law, the law of Moses, and if the Christians would have followed the teaching of Jesus, and there were Christians there, apparently the same thing, happened with them. But if they would have followed those teachings, they would have been fine, okay? And so that we have to keep that in mind. And just to flip down, so Jackie, you just as a spin-off of this, as people today, I would imagine that in the minds of Muslims who know Jews, I mean, if you're a Muslim living in the United States and you know the Jewish community, there's a synagogue, and you know that in your town, I mean, you're an enlightened person, you're an American, a Muslim who's an American citizen, okay? Family's been here for 2 generations, whatever. So, quasi-assimilated, but religious, Orthodox, not Islamist, Orthodox Muslim. And you look around at your community, and your community is going to the mosque on a regular basis, whatever. And you know that you'd have, there's a Jewish community over here, but 10%, 20% of them go to synagogue, and the other ones don't. So what's your impression, okay? And obviously, the more you go to the Islamist extreme, that's going to be carried even to greater extreme. So you can see how what in a certain sense, the assimilation of Jews in the United States, would reinforce what Muhammad is teaching in the Quran, and the same in Israel. Now, of course, that's much more complicated because clearly in Israel, and I would imagine in the generation of the founders of the state, and I don't want to try to make a parallel. Obviously, there are real life situations that over the course of the 20th century that were radically different from here. I mean, Muslims were not killing Jews. Jews were not killing Muslims here in the United States in the 20s and 30s and 40s, right? That wasn't happening. That was happening over there. So obviously the feelings on both sides are very strong. Okay? But still, very often, I can imagine, let's say it's in the 1920s, and you have kibbutzim opening up in the areas, where there are no Muslims, but nearby are Muslim villages. And at the beginning, there's, raison, they accept one another. It wasn't noisy at the beginning. And so, okay, fine. But who are the people generally who have founded these kibbutzim? They're not the Orthodox, right? There were a few, but most of the Orthodox were in the towns. They needed a yeshiva. They needed to have, a Beit Knesset. These are secular, right? And they're doing things, they're talking about things that have nothing to do with Judaism, socialists, whatever. And suddenly they say, oh my God, look at that. Where's the synagogue on that kibbutz? So again, you can see how the interpretation of the situation would fit in with what's already in the Quran. Complicates it, doesn't it? So it's just keep that in mind. All right. So, Tybal, and then we're going to read.
The way you said that, it seemed interesting to me that mosques were so well established not that far after everything started. But I also wondered if anything is known or you happen to know about how copies of the Quran were transmitted? Was it just oral that some memorized, or there were manuscripts all over?
I don't know. I mean, Muslims were literate. They were literate. They wrote. Remember, where did Jews get our laws of grammar? From Muslims in Spain, right? They based our laws of grammar on Arabic grammar because common denominator is the 3-letter root of the language. Okay, so writing and reading for Muslims was a big deal. I don't know what the literacy rate was or is. I have no idea. But I can tell you reading with them is a big deal, but also reading out loud is a big deal. Memorization is a big deal. So I don't know literacy. I cannot tell you that. But having remember, after the printing press, the Qurans are being printed also. But yeah, there's no question that things were written down. Absolutely. Jackie?
But I'm guessing, and I don't know, we as Jews have the Talmud from way back, which was analyzing and going back and forth, and I think was a spawn for the Jewish creativity in science and other fields, among other things of Judaism. But do Muslims have anything, or did they?
Yes, you have pieces of it. It's called the Hadith.
Okay.
You there's things in here. It says Hadith. And there's an explanation of what they were. They are the equivalent of the Talmud.
Okay.
And they were compiled and written down within a century and continued to develop afterward. And remember, at the outset, the Muslims were the ones who developed medieval science. Baghdad, Cordoba, right? Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, all came from there.
So Maimonides, a top position?
Aristotle.
Yeah, that's prior, but I'm saying Maimonides, how was he educated?
He studied medicine with Muslim doctors. Remember, Rambam was the doctor in the court of the vizier of Egypt.
Right. I knew he was the doctor. I didn't know he was taught by them.
Yes, sure. And ultimately, he studied the Islamic philosophy in Arabic. He quotes the philosophers. They're philosophers. And there's a whole rich tradition of Islamic philosophy, Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism. In fact, they were the ones who broke the ground that the Jews walked on afterward. Saadia Gaon in 900 was using the approaches of Islamic theology that were used before him in Babel, in Iraq.
But Maimonides' steps of charity, that was Jewish. That wasn't a Muslim.
What was?
His steps, the levels of charity.
That's in the law code.
Yeah, well, it's Jewish.
Yes, but what about the Guide of the Perplexed? Do you know? Have you heard of it? The Moreh Nevuchim?
I haven't looked at that, but I've heard of it. He wrote that too.
That's a book of philosophy.
Right, okay.
Completely. And the whole concept, if you read the beginning of the Mishnah Torah of the law code, he cites the astronomy and science of the age at the beginning in a way that the average person can understand, okay? It doesn't begin, the law code begins with statements of philosophy, and that's halakha. And he says that you should study, you have to take your day and divide it up into different times, and you have Bible, rabbinics, and then philosophy. And that's in the Mishnah Torah, the law code. After the philosophy in the law code, you have health, how to stay healthy, and that's law. So he basically has taken Islamic principle and built it not only into the philosophy, but into the law of Torah.
But the Talmud was written centuries before Islam existed.
He uses, it's all based on Talmud. He weaves it into Talmudic law.
Right.
But he's thinking like, look, in the 13th century, his books were burned. You know where?
By Christians, I'm guessing? I don't know.
No, in France, by rabbis.
Oh, boy. Why?
Because they were philosophers. Southern France knew and appreciated. Northern France did not. And they had the books burned in 1230. Not all of them. The Mishnah Torah they appreciated. But there were parts of it, I'm sure they did. And the Guide of the Perplexed. Boom. His Rambam's commentary on Pirkei Avot contains within it certain ethical principles that clearly are lifted right out of Aristotle. So, and that where did he get all that? And what language was all that written? The only thing that was written in Hebrew is the law code, because he meant that for the entire Jewish people. All the other literature was written in Arabic, because that was the language, and that was the language of the intelligence, the Jewish intelligence. So yes, and all this came from Islamic, an understanding of Islam, and what happened was the stream is it's just like today, right? Look what's happened to science in the last 40 years, the last 20 years, the last 10 years. The value of science. It's science. Who cares? Science doesn't know anything. You hear that all over the place. It's only science. These are better ideas. That's what happened. You have these pendulum swings, and we're going through one. The only question is where's it going to lead? You stop, you nullify science in this country, let's say, it's going to pop up elsewhere. And who's going to move into the future? Elsewhere. I mean, that's what happened around the world. When all that secular knowledge became impact, Islamic country ruled the Mediterranean. When that system fell apart, because of a variety of reasons, we cannot go. Then the Christians took that over, and you had the Renaissance of the 12th century in Europe, where a lot of that stuff, and Jews were translating Arabic into Latin so the Christians could study it. And then you have a response in Christianity in the course of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. That's when the blood libels developed, right? That whole approach to thinking about the world, filled with mythologies that are not true, anti-science, right? So this pendulum swung. Then later on, you have the Enlightenment, right? In the 18th, 19th century, and it went back the other way, secularism. Now you have internationally in the Western world and in the Middle East, Orthodox religion is taking. Okay, so I mean, that seems to be the fate of the human race. Whenever we find the middle, very often, and Maimonides tried to find the middle. Sadhya tried to find the middle, okay? And even Ramban with his mysticism tried to find the middle, the balance. But for some reason, it doesn't hold, okay? Because it's only a stopping point in the pendulum swing. And the pendulum's got to swing over here until you get zonked. Then it goes back over here and gets zonked.
But the last point on this, at some point whether it was the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, something stopped in Islam with science, and every major scientific discovery from the 1700s through today is Jews and Christians, and Jews way above percentage-wise Jews. I mean, I could go through the list in science and medicine, and Islam pretty much zero. So that's what unless there's something I don't know about.
No,
but everything, there's a reason there's called Alzheimer's and Epstein-Barr. I mean, these are Jewish names. These were the people that invented it. DNA.
No, Jackie, we all know that.
Well, I don't think the world appreciates it.
No, we know it. Yes.
But the world doesn't appreciate it. No.
Correct. Well, there are a lot of people who do. But the fact is, that process began in the Middle Ages, and over time it continued to perpetuate. But you still had areas in the world where Muslims were relatively tolerant, and that's a fact. Because in North Africa, even though when Rambam moved into North Africa, he had to leave and go to Egypt because that's where the extremists were, and the ones who took over Spain and kicked his family. But over time, that whole area, there was, everybody live and let live, okay? But there's no resurgence of science in Judaism either. Okay, then Kabbalah took over, and that filled the void. And from the 5th, 16th to the 19th centuries, Kabbalah was the main thrust of Jewish religious thought. You gradually had in the 19th century, well, starting with the 18th, with Moses Mendelssohn, the beginning of modern Jewish philosophy, right? And that was part of a switch over. But studying, learning, and things like that were always part of our culture. So when Jews went from the shtetls in Eastern Europe, where there was no science, right? They moved into the areas of Western Europe and the United States where there was the notion of learning, a value that we kept alive, right? Except our learning during the period I mentioned was not with science. It was mysticism. which is very, you think about it, Kabbalah is very complicated, and required a good mind. But if you're now taking that sort of approach and transferring over, go to college, my son, right? That's what our grandparents and great-grandparents were telling their children. Go to college, become an American, right? Because that's how you can, right? So, but because we knew our culture, there were elements of our culture, the sociology of our culture, and the learning in our culture, were very significant, right? So that's why what you said happened. And in a sense, that's what happened in the Middle Ages too. Jews jumped into that because it fit in with the whole concept of Talmudic learning. The skills of Talmudic learning, using the brain, analyzing, etc., were transferred over to medieval Jewish philosophy. And similarly, the skills of that philosophy were transferred over into mysticism. There's a lot of Neoplatonism and other kinds of isms that are not Jewish that were part of the intelligentsia of Europe in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, which fed into Kabbalah. Nachmanides, Ramban, 13th century Spain, all right? Girona, a center of Islamic, of Jewish mysticism, okay? Brilliant mind, brilliant halachas, Bible scholar, and mystic, okay? Not Rambam, the antithesis. But here, Ramban respected Rambam because of his mind. And they wanted to burn his books in Spain, but he can't because he's a great mind and he's got a great law code. All right, so you get the picture. But at least by us, the concept of learning was kept alive. And that's one of the key. And that died in Islam. That was the tragedy. It died now it's sort of coming back. Think of Iran. There's scientists up there, aren't they? Unfortunately, they're not always doing those things. They're scientists because, there are elements. If you open up your mind, unfortunately, it's been categorized in this direction. Very good. All right. Well, that was interesting. Jackie, you asked questions. Thank you. Good. No, I think it was important. You have to understand these trends. It's confusing, it's challenging, and especially when you're in the middle of it and you understand what the implication, you worry. Somebody's got to knock someone's heads, or right now it's here. And already they're talking over there. Fine. Let them. The Americans want to do this and that. We'll take over. You hear it in Europe now. You hear it in China, India. And that's the last thing in the world we want. But see where we are in 5-10. It's not good. All right. Let's now look at Jews as people of the book. And I see Cheryl is really eager to read. So
I'm mourning over your last remarks. It's such a dark time. Okay, I'm eager to read. Here I go.
Go ahead.
Jews as people of the book. O Apostle Muhammad.
Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you. Sorry.
Yeah.
One other point. I mentioned it once, but now's the time. All right. Apostle, right? So apostle, prophet, teacher, whatever. Those are the titles that that refer to Muhammad in the Quran. I mentioned, I think last time or 2 times ago, his name, the name Muhammad, appears very rarely. And
so
whose name, which great religious thinker appears most in the Quran?
It looks like Moses, but I have no idea.
Yes, Musa.
Wow.
Over 150.
So he's referring to himself. He's the voice, right? Who's the voice who says, "Oh, Apostle"?
That's Gabriel.
Oh, so Gabriel's calling out to him, and he's recording what Gabriel said.
Exactly. And when he doesn't say, when it's something different, because he's talking about what it says, which you have been sent to you from your Lord, right? So Gabriel is talking about something that Muhammad learned from God. So when it doesn't have something like that, then Muhammad what has been written down is written. That is the message from God. When it's from Gabriel, it will have this third party, refer to God in the third party. Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
Go ahead. All right. So Cheryl, now go ahead.
Okay. So, O Apostle, proclaim the message which hath been sent to thee from thy Lord. If thou didst not, thou wouldst not have fulfilled and proclaimed his mission. And Allah will defend thee from men, who mean mischief. For Allah guideth not those who reject.
Okay, all right. So the angel is telling him, do what God told you to do, because God will be there for you. God's not there for people who reject him, but for you, he's there. So do it. Don't be afraid. Now, go ahead, say.
Say, O people of the book. That's us, right?
No, it's us, but well, you'll see in the next sentence. Go ahead.
Ye have no ground to stand upon unless ye stand fast by the law, the gospel, and all the revelation that has come to you from your Lord.
Okay, so now you see what he's saying?
Also the Christian gospel?
Yes, that's the gospel, right. And other revelation could be Zoroastrian. Okay. So these are the message. Allah's messages come in these texts, and these people should be told to stand on those texts. Don't disparage. Don't walk away from them. Paul.
So there are three things there: law, gospel, and other revelations.
Right. Law is Torah.
So I just
right. And other revelations, it could be that Sabians are mentioned, which is another form. Okay, but we know for a fact that but the Zoroastrianism, remember, they took over Persia, and it's a huge Zoroastrian population. And even though they are really binary, right, there's a good God and a bad God, they are very close to the monotheistic faith in their perspectives on things. So the Muslims include them as the part of the people of the book. But so that's the air when he says other revelation. So he's saying, God appears in many different places, and these are kosher for you. So that's the foundation. Remember what we said at the outset. Muhammad expected the Jews and the Christians and the Zoroastrians to live according to the religious laws that God told them. And God will be there for them if they do that. If they don't, then God will not be there for them. All right? Okay, continue.
It is the revelation that cometh to thee from thy Lord that increaseth in most of them their obstinate rebellion and blasphemy.
Right. In other words, the revelation that come to Muhammad, and which would be also found by extension in the revelations, the legitimate revelations of these other faiths, they push against those who do not follow in those communities, who do not follow the laws, tradition that God gave them, that they're threatened and they will push back. And so Muhammad here is talking about the experience that he had in Medina, right? He moved forward based upon his faith in Allah, right? And he was pushing against those who should have followed that law or the laws of Torah or the laws of the Gospels, etc., etc. But because they were assimilated, they pushed back. In other words, they jumped into bed with the pagan and fought against Muhammad when he waged war against the pagan in Medina. And that's astounded him. How come you joined forces with the pagans? You should have joined forces with us. But because you joined forces with the pagans, you're pushing back on us. Because you should appreciate us the way we're willing to appreciate you. And that's what he's saying. And of course, with respect to particular, he was really hurt because he was willing to do certain things to accommodate their faith. I mean, initially it is said in some of the interpretations of his life that he was going to have the Sabbath on the seventh day, and he was going to observe Yom Kippur. But when the Jews pushed back because they participated with the pagans, he said, forget it. So he had his own system of forgiveness, and Friday became their holy day, right? The Jews had Saturday, the Christians had Sunday, so he took Friday. Okay.
I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. But sorrow thou not over these people without faith, those who believe in the Quran, those who follow the Jewish scriptures, and the Sabians and the Christians, any who believe in Allah and the last day and work righteousness. On them shall be no fear, nor shall they grieve.
Right. That's the point. It's clear, right? We got nothing to worry about. If we're good Jews, we got nothing. And in principle, that's what he communicated. But unfortunately, looked around, realized that there are a lot of Jews in Medina who aren't doing that, too much aligned with the pagans. And I'm going to guess there's no reason to assume that they were necessarily from Jews. We don't know a lot about the organized Jew, nothing, right? And they're in the Arabian. All right. Okay. Now, but here's the next, which is very. Okay, Paul, please read. Allah bless the children of Israel.
Allah bless the children of Israel. Remember, am I muted? Remember when Moses said to his people, my people, remember Allah's blessing to you when he appointed prophets among you and appointed kings for you and gave you what he had not given to anyone else in all the worlds. My people, enter the holy land which Allah has ordained for you. Do not turn back in your tracks and so become transformed into losers.
Well, this is what Moses told Israelites. You have prophets, kings, this is all good, and nobody else at that time had any of this. Enter the holy land which Allah has ordained. Do not turn back in your tracks. Become transformed. In other words, if you're going to take the land, you have to live the Torah. But use the concept of Eretz Yisrael, a land that was in the Quran, with a big but. Now, that's the problem, because a 20th century Muslim imam who is an extremist, or even not an extremist, they look into the land, they look at the state of Israel, let's say it's 1950, okay, and you've just suffered a horrible defeat, right? Israel, the independent state of Israel exists, and you see all these Jews, and what was the dominant, we talked about this before, what was the dominant culture of the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in 1950?
Wasn't it secular kibbutzim?
Yes. Well, not just kibbutz, even in the cities. Yes, it was secular, right? The Jews were building an auditorium, right? Developing the Jerusalem Symphony. Yes. Museums, right? All these museums, you find the artifacts of ancient Judaism, right? People may have put mezuzot on their doorposts. There were a lot of people who didn't, because they were really rabid secularists. And, at that point in time, remember, David Ben-Gurion created the rabbinate, right? It was under his leadership. In order to get the votes, to be able to declare independence, needed to have the Orthodox, the religious Jewish community on his side. Because, they were not huge and growing like they are now, but they were present. He had all the support he could. So he allowed for the rabbinate of Israel, and two of the leading Orthodox rabbis were accepted the position, Sephardic and Ashkenaz, and he got their votes. So basically, the law of the country, remember, there's no constitution, and this is part of the problem, but the law became that these religions would govern the private life of the people, marriage, death, right, all those things, conversion. Nobody ever thought of conversion. Existed. Who would ever do it there? But anyway, so that's how we ended up with the dilemma that we have today, where you have a national rabbinate that does that. Of course, for many of the Haredi community, they don't think it's enough. It's gone. And nobody would have imagined that the Haredim would be such a prominent force, even in the United States. What caused that shift? The massive people came over from the Haredi community, the survivors of the Holocaust, both here and there, were Haredim. And they moved in, continued to observe their form of, which included having large families, the demographic of that and there. All right. Anyhow, so, one could argue when the Haredim, stop talking. I can't do it. Sorry. I have to. Anyway, theoretically, I don't know if the Muslims are thinking, in 20, 30 years, it's very possible that Haredim will be the dominant population in Israel. So the question is, are they going to go now? If you go to the Muslim authority, you say, hey, guys, we've done it. We've now taken over. This country to be run according to the law of Moses, right? And you guys said, I quote, right over here, if we follow the law of Moses, we're doing good, okay? We're following the law of Moses in this country. We're doing good. Lay off. That's not, anyway. But, theoretically, Tybal.
Yeah, but full well, supersessionism, they're going to say, no, you're not, because we know better than you, and this is how it should be. It just would never work.
I don't know if that would work or what I said.
No, because the point is that whether it's Christian or Muslim, That's what supersessionism is, the
But
belief
that's
that you're
all right.
defining, right?
That's all based on interpretation. And what's the interpretation? Okay. And if the Muslims in that part of the world come to realize that making war with the Israelis is not a good thing, okay, because everybody says damage all over them. So maybe let's say, okay, Haredim, go ahead, you run Eretz Yisrael. We'll leave you alone. You leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. And everybody will, because that's the will of Allah. I don't know, probably, but you can think of it hypothetically. Okay. But here, move on. Okay. All right, Paul, why don't you, the next one's short. Read it as well. Allah protects synagogue.
If Allah had not driven some people back by means of others, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, where Allah's name is mentioned much, would have been pulled down and destroyed. Allah will certainly help those who help him. Allah is all strong, almighty.
So you see here, look what it says. Monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, where Allah's name is mentioned much. Look who's included. All of them, right? If those, as long as they are, God will protect as long as they're doing what to do. So, this is you could be, and by the way, there's no question that during those centuries, Jews were allowed to be relatively open and free with their traditions, even though theoretically they were subjugated. I don't want to forget that, right? Sadia lived as a subjugated Jew, but it was a benign subjugation. It wasn't any kind of supersessionism. It was tolerance. In fact, it was more than tolerance. At that point in time, the Reish Galuta, the head of the Jewish community in Iraq, in Babel, had a place in the court of the Caliph. And when he came in to visit the Caliph, it was like a royal procession going to, it was a big deal. So, they had it because the Muslims at that time were reading these paragraphs of the Quran and not so much the other one, these elements of the Hadiths and not so much of the other one. When the extremists took over, then it went in the other. It all depends what you're going to look, right? And it's the same thing with halakha, right? You can go into a conservative synagogue, a conservative home, and find kashrut and find, traditional expression, and go into a modern Orthodox home and find certain others that you're not going to find in the conservative, but they're going to be very similar, and people would be comfortable eating in both places. But then you go into a place that suddenly becomes sold on glot meat, and you can come and eat with them, but they won't come and eat with you because your meat is only kosher. And that happens right here in Pico Robertson to the modern Orthodox. There are modern Orthodox who are right of the other modern Orthodox, and that forces the more liberal modern Orthodox to get glot meat, even though they would prefer not to. Believe me, Yisrael, my son-in-law, has plenty of business. Thank God. It's wonderful, nothing wrong. But his business would probably have improved even greater. He could have up another store somewhere if that wasn't going on, because he's got an Orthodox rabbi, a frum Orthodox rabbi, young guy. I met him. He's a great guy, open-minded, but he knows, okay? He's a mashgiach. He's a man of reputation, but it's not close. So, it's the same. We have it right here next door. What are you interpreting, and how are you interpreting, right? That's it. So that's what's going on here. All right. Now, on the other hand, an approach that, we see today as much more dominant in the Muslim. All right. Barbara, please read.
I don't know if you want me to read. I might start coughing. I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
When my grandparents came here from what was Russia, now Moldova, they were Orthodox. They persisted to be Orthodox. It was, and everybody, it seems to me, was like that in those days that came to America. Why is it that these particularly Orthodox, the Haredi, why do they all go to Israel and want to take over? Nobody seemed to want to take over when they came to the United States. At least that's what I gather. Have you any explanation for the difference in the way the people function?
When they went over to Israel, they didn't take over right away.
No,
it took a while. And the numbers, they didn't all come in at once. But once they felt secure, and I can't give you
okay.
It's clear, when I was in Israel in the 1960s, all right? And we would go, there was none of this attacking of conservative shuls. There were conservative shuls and Tel Aviv, but particularly, but they were left alone. Over time, when the realities, a major turning was when the Russians, late 80s and 90s, right? Because I had a whole group of people within that group who were not Jews. So the issue of conversion became a big issue. It was in the Knesset, the rabbinate had to deal with it, and that's when suddenly, and that's one factor that began to shape the push to the right and the push for power. But there was a second factor around the same time. That's Chabad. The Rebbe in the early 70s was already pushing for a more extreme position against non-Orthodox Jews in Israel. Okay? Because that was a Haredi approach. But he was already utilizing his influence. And this is documented. This is not something that somebody made, okay? And the whole notion of worldwide rejection of halachically correct religious rituals that were performed by non-Orthodox or modern Orthodox, these elements began to question their validity. And that became more and more prominent. So the process that I'm talking, it took time. It didn't happen. And the whole notion, we still in the Haredim, the arch enemies of Chabad, Satmar, they don't accept the existence of the state of Israel. Their people, 20 years ago, went to Tehran to support the Ayatollah.
Really?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that I've been hearing about by that group. Yeah, they're anti-Israel.
Yes, of course. And there are a few other groups you don't hear so much about that have the same position. So, it's crazy. All right. Yeah, I see your hand, Cheryl. Just one comment. There were people who came over in the between 1880 and 920 who came from religious homes, but who were ignorant. Okay. They didn't know why they were doing. And they sent their kids to college. The kids would come home and they would ask, Dad, Mom, why are you doing that? And they would, it's tradition, right? Like a fiddler, right? Tradition. That was the answer. They didn't know. These were the people who went to daily minyan and they could daven. I'm talking about at Beth Am, the old guys, right? They could daven. Ask them, what do you say? What's the meaning of what you're saying? And don't look at the English translation. I don't know. They daven.
Really?
There were
people like Zurch didn't totally understand.
I don't know how much he knew. I knew that Abe, what's his name, who took over for Zurch.
And Max Zisovich understood, I think, everything.
He was a Yodea Sefer. He was knowledgeable.
And Israel Rosenberg knew everything, I think.
Yeah. So there were people who did, but who didn't. And that was my. Don't ask. My father, may he rest in peace, had a Malamed who came and taught him for his bar mitzvah, okay? And my father would ask him questions. And what was the answer? Don't ask, just do it. No. People thought that the majority of Jews who came over, the men, were rabbis. In all of the years from our sociologists looked into that, okay? Between 1880 and 1920. In those years, you know how many rabbis came to America?
Very few.
300.
Really?
Out of 2.5 million Jews. Now, if you ask the Jews how many rabbis there were, thousands. 300, and more than half of them went back because we were not the gold in the Medina. We were the Treifa Medina. Okay, that's what they called it. America, the Treifa Medina. Right? Yeah. So knowledgeable is one thing. Not knowledgeable is something else. All right, Cheryl.
I just finished reading a book that I think is relevant to the point. It's Chaim Grada, the Yiddish writer. His last book has finally been translated into English, and it's a picture of. It's called Sons and Daughters. It's a picture of a rabbi in Russia in a smallish town, and it's right from the very late 1800s till about 1925-ish.
Yeah.
All of his children disappoint him. One becomes a chalutz. It doesn't really matter, but in this book, you get a picture of the people who would never have gone to Israel and would never have come here. if it hadn't been for the Holocaust. Most of them, we know as you're reading the book, you know most of these people are going to die because they're not going to make it. But you also hear their attitudes about the Treifa Medina and about Israel, and they do not want to engage to take over Israel or to take over the American Jewish world. They think that it's a dead end Jewishly. Both of those are dead.
Exactly. There were those. Look, I don't know the numbers, but there was a substantial amount of the who came over here in those years and went back. I'm not just talking about
Right.
the more knowledgeable and the more serious they were in their tradition went back.
Well, these are all highly educated yeshiva people. And one of the kids ends up going to become a rabbi in America. I'll just say one thing. And they say you should not do that because the Americans don't listen to their rabbis, even the Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah.
Anyway, I won't say more, but I recommend the book if you want the flavor.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of truth. All right, Tybal, and we want to move on.
I just wanted to say it reminded me, and I'm blocking on his name, but I have a relative who was made Aliyah early. He was a rival to Ben Gurion. He founded whatever, and he left Israel because it wasn't communist enough and went back to Russia, where, of course, he was later murdered.
Right. Yeah. That's the other side of the coin, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. So Barbara, your voice is in good shape. So, all right, Tybal, Jews as corrupters of the word of God.
Indeed, we sent down the Torah, in which was guidance and light.
Who's the we?
Yeah, a little bit of chutzpah, we.
Well, no, that's God's.
Yeah, but God speaking through Muhammad.
Yeah, but we means God.
No, I get it, but
God can say whatever God.
Yeah, but we think prophecy stopped with Zephaniah, who was the last prophet I'm blocking. Whatever. Prophecy stopped with at the end, way back when. Anyway, okay. The prophets had submitted to Allah, judged by it for the Jews, as did the rabbis and scholars by that with which they were entrusted of the scripture of Allah, and they were witnesses thereto.
All right, so the scripture itself and the scholars who knew the scripture were doing the will of God. Go ahead.
And when the anger subsided in Moses, he took up the tablets, and in their inscription was guidance and mercy for those who were fearful of their Lord.
Right. And what did he do with them?
He broke them, the first ones.
Because right away, the people were moving away from what God required.
Yeah, but it's not just what the people did, but then he needed anger management.
So, next one, go ahead.
So woe to those who write the scripture with their own hands and then say, this is from Allah, in order to exchange it for a small price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for what they earn.
So this is really not clear. Are these the rabbis and scholars who have written? Because by that time, the Talmud was actually being written down. Or are these people who were really claiming to know and basically are writing down ideas that they attribute to, but aren't? And the question is Midrash included? It's not clear. The rabbi, my point, because in a certain respect, that was the claim that the Karaites ended up making, that the rabbis did their own interpretation, which is not what the Torah says. And that spilled down interest by virtue of Jews who converted to Christianity in the course of the 12th and 13th century. The word was out that the Jews do not follow the Bible, the word of Moses, but they follow of the rabbis, and that's the Talmud. And for that reason, were burned by Christians. And it's interesting because I can show you two in particular, one in the 11th century, one in the 12th century. One was a convert and one was not. Both of them were making that point that the Jews no longer are the people of the book, and that ultimately what had been going on for centuries, part of the rationale for tolerating them, was no longer the reality. So that's the question. Now, you can imagine today an imam reading could make the point that the rabbis, I don't know, I have not seen, but the rabbis, are doing just that. All right. Now let's turn the page. We got that. This is a real good one. All right.
What are the sentence numbers before each of these things from?
Say again.
Well, the beginning in the corrupter, or even in the Jews do not follow. There's 2-61, and then for Ezra 9:30.
That's the Quran.
That's Quran numbers. Okay.
Chapter and verse. Yeah. Book and verse or paragraph. Okay. Jews do not follow God's. All right. Okay. Paul.
Jews do not follow God's teaching and kill prophets. And when you said, O Musa, we cannot bear with one food, therefore pray, Lord, on our behalf to bring forth for us out of what the earth grows, of its herbs, its cucumbers, and its garlic, and its lentils, and its onions.
What is he talking about?
The complaints in the desert, right?
Exactly.
When they were saying we were better off in Egypt, we had this stuff to eat.
Right. Complaint in the desert. Go ahead, continue.
He said, will you exchange that which is better for that which is worse?
Right.
In other words, the manna that they're getting is better than all the other things because it's a gift from God. And how can you deny that which is from God immediately for your purpose? That definitely has to supersede the value of the other things that you have to, grow. You can't grow it in the desert, actually. Go ahead. So that's exchanging the better, the manna, for the worse. Continue.
Enter a city, so you will have what you ask for. And abasement and humiliation were brought down upon them, and they became deserving of Allah's wrath. This was so because they disbelieved in the communications of Allah and killed the prophets unjustly. This was so because they disobeyed and exceeded the limits.
All right, so you moved in. It's interesting. You moved into it, right? And you can have whatever you want, right? But while they were there, ultimately in the city, they suffered from God's anger because of what they did and how they lived in the city. They killed the prophet, among other things, and they disobeyed and exceeded the limits on their behavior. And again, that's what he saw in the city. What city? Medina. Right, exactly. And of course, killing the prophets, he doesn't have to go to Medina. You can find it. Elijah is on Mount Sinai talking to God, okay? 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 10. I am moved by my zeal for you, Adonai. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets. I am alone. That's out of the mouth of Elijah. Okay, and that's exactly he's talking, and that's the Jews. That's what he experienced. Who fight against these tribes, clan, who sided with the. But now there's another people that had really very, very dangerous implications for the Jews. Cheryl, Ezra, son of.
Okay, Ezra. Am I unmuted? Yeah. Ezra, son of God. The Jews say Ezra, Uzair, is the son of Allah. And the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. That is their statement from their mouth. They imitate the saying of those who disbelieved before them. May Allah destroy them. How are they deluded?
Right.
What does it mean?
So he is assuming that the Jews say Ezra is the son of. Now we don't actually have a statement like that in the book of Ezra. But it is clear that he is the voice of the Torah in the community because it says that he read the entire Torah in the book of Ezra, the people. And the belief that evolved out of this in the Islamic community is that what Ezra read in that scroll had corrupted the law of Moses. And the Israelites, the Jews, were following this corrupt teaching. And that's because Ezra stuck his nose into it and assumed that he had the authority to change the words of Moses. And so where do you go then to get the true words of Moses? And this is the way it is interpreted for centuries. Who gives you the true meaning of the words of Moses? Who? One word.
Muhammad.
Muhammad will give you the true meaning of Moses because he spoke to God directly. Ezra did not. And yet you call Ezra the son of God. That's a mistake. I mean, I don't know where he got, but that's there. And that had that line was significant in how Islam was teaching about the Jews. Yes, they have to be tolerated. We are the book, but we have to be very much controlled because the way we are following the law of Moses is the wrong one. And Rambam, it's interesting, at the end of the the Mishnah Torah, in the last paragraph of Hilchot Melachim, the Law of Kings, the end of the Mishnah Torah, his law code, he talks of Christian and Muslim, and he says both of them have a monotheism in them. He's more comfortable with the Muslim form of monotheism because that is pure monotheism. Christianity has a problem because it's got a trinity, and that's not kosher, but they try. And Islam, yes, it is the most, other than us, Jews, monotheistic. It's good. It's a harbinger. It's teaching things the world needs to know. But you may not teach the Torah to a Muslim. You can teach the Torah to a Christian because they will revere the Torah, because it is part of the book that they study and respect. They may not follow it, but they will revere it. But you may not teach the Torah to a Muslim because they revile the Torah, because it is not the true words of God. There are misinterpretations, mistakes, misleading statements that Ezra put in. So respect their monotheism, but don't go near don't let them near the Torah. All right. And so he says they have their place in the world in their own way, spreading the Torah of monotheism, but they're flawed. And that's exactly what Christianity said about Judaism and Islam, and that's what the Muslims say about Judaism and Christianity. All right, we got it, but we missed the boat. We're almost there. Yeah, Barbara, and then we're going to start.
Sorry. When we were in Bosnia, the TBA group this year, we met with 6 Muslims, 2 of whom were imams. And first we met and talked with them, and then we had dinner with them, and each Muslim went to a different table. And from what I gathered, because I talked to people at different tables, they all were pretty much the same. Because I wanted to know the difference between kosher and halal. I figured you can't get it any better than talking to these Muslims. And I thought it was interesting because we know that kosher, you can only be touched by kosher people, by Jews. But the Muslim foods can be cut by Jews, by Christians, by any people of the book. I thought that was, because I've never understood. I see signs halal. It sounds like it could be kosher, but it can be cut by a Christian butcher, a Jewish butcher, a Muslim butcher. I thought that was really interesting. That's all I wanted to say.
We're more strict.
That's what I just said. Ours has to be cut by a Jew.
Right, but we're strict because we have specific requirements of life and of the way the cut is made and draining of the blood. I mean, I haven't seen the details of the halal, but my impression is that the custom, which is older, obviously, much more demanding.
Well, apparently, according to him, the way the blood was drained was pretty similar to what ours is.
That's possible. The draining of the blood is possible. Again, how do you do it?
But with a sharp knife and all, but I can't go into those details because I don't know them.
Okay,
but I was just amazed that, and because we're talking here about the people of the book.
Yeah, but we're close on that. Look, there's no question. But this is the notion that a Orthodox Jew would not
touch halal. I agree.
Let me finish. An Orthodox Jew might not eat in the home of a conservative Jew because we don't wait 6 hours between milk and meat, okay? Whereas we would eat in the home of an Orthodox because they wait at least 3 hours, but they wait 6 on that point alone, all right?
Mm-hmm.
There are ways in which we are more liberal in our interpretation of what represents a cleansed item, I mean, in terms of washing, as opposed to what they would require. Details, minute details. The whole notion of dark chocolate that has no milk in it whatsoever, all right? Requiring it's supervised, and the supervising entities look at that. So the conservative movement would say it's parve. The Orthodox would say it's milchik because the equipment on which it was made may not have been properly cleansed, and you may have had a run of milk chocolate before that. And our argument, a cleansing, number one, the amount of, if there, first of all, we don't know for a fact that what preceded the dark chocolate was milk chocolate. We don't know that. It's a hashash. It's a possibility, all right? And we could make the point that in matters of the minutia that is rabbinically designed in the Talmud, right? It's legit, but if it's a doubt does not mandate an extreme position, a strict position. That's a principle in the Talmud. If it's rabbinic law, doubt does not mandate a strict reading. All right? That subtle point. But because of that, the Orthodox won't, necessarily eat in our house. So that's very subtle.
Well, we were just talking actually about the cuts of meat that they would eat, and I thought it was interesting using the term "the people of the book," which we've just been reading, and using the term "the people of the book." And that was the reason I mentioned it.
I understand, right? But I mean, I've never lost. It's a good question. I mean, I've never been interested in doing it. Well, here, Barbara, I have an assignment for you. Go online and say, what are the requirements for halal meat? All right, we got to end. I'll see you all next week. Stay well, and I can't wish you Chag Sameach. I think we're finished.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.